cousin who I'd never met, and he came to see me in my office. I was beyond my retirement. I mean, I could have been retired for 3 years, but he just came through the door and he said, "Would you give me my badge at my graduation?" I thought, that'd make a hell of a last day on the job, and that's what I did.
She's a criminal profiler trained by the FBI in Quantico, Virginia. She was one of the first women to work as an undercover cop for the Ontario Provincial Police, and she's done profiling work for such notorious cases as the Bernardo Homolka murders. Before retiring, she was the first woman chief superintendent of the OPP. We met Kate Lines in Toronto.
Kate, when did you know you wanted to be a cop? How old were you, do you think?
I was 21.
Yeah?
I was 21, yeah. I met a friend of my roommates who was a Toronto police officer. I was going to the University of Toronto out in Mississauga, and I talked to a roommate's cousin who was a police officer, and I thought, I might just give this a try.
What was the appeal?
The appeal was I was graduating. I didn't have a job, so
Okay,
that was appealing to actually have a full-time job when I graduated. But I've always been the kind of person that's sort of like, nothing ventured, nothing gained. Let's give it a shot. Maybe I won't like it, but I think just from hearing him talk and having some pretty positive experiences with police officers in my past, I thought, yeah, give it a try, and 33 years later, I left it.
There you go. I thought it was interesting that your first attempt at signing up, you failed the psychological test.
Yeah, pretty interesting, especially given the field that I go into. But yeah, and did the same test when I joined the OPP several months later and passed that one.
But that made me really curious, because what sort of stuff are they asking you at that point to see if you're psychologically capable of being a police officer?
I think it was called the Minnesota Multiphasic, something like that, because I can remember taking a big gulp when I sat down at the OPP desk and thought, oh, this is the one that apparently I had trouble with before, but I thought, well, let's concentrate, let's just do the best we can, and I passed it the second time.
So they're asking you what your attitudes or your...
Yeah, religion, lifestyle, culture, all those kinds of things.
And so when you fail it, they don't tell you why, right?
No, they don't.
They just leave that big question mark.
Well, they just say you failed the psychological. So,
Not something you want to be carrying around with you. It's a good thing you passed it the next time.
Yeah, I did.
So once you get into it, I want to talk to you about the undercover work that you did initially, because it's always seemed to me, I know some police officers over the years, and in fact, one of them currently, who I know is currently the head of the RCMP, and Bob Paulson, and he used to do undercover work. And I know how hairy and how stressful it can be. Was that the case for you? Was it a really stressful thing to do?
You know what? I don't think particularly stressful. When I think back of it, if I was to say something about the downside, when you're an OPP officer and you're doing the entire province of Ontario, it can be kind of lonely sometimes, especially if you're the only officer that's working and, you know, you've got a cover team somewhere nearby, but, you know, you can be 2 or 3 months away from home. And so from that, but I only had a couple of situations where I can honestly say I was like, oh, I got to get out of this one, okay. And the only thing you have really, you don't have any weapons, you don't have a billy stick or a gun, you got to use your mouth to get out of whatever sticky situation you're in.
It was interesting, actually, because when you're describing it in your book, you talk about having to, like, you literally move into a place.
Yes, become a member of the community.
You take over that life.
Yeah.
How long would these operations often go on?
Well, I think some were probably close to, I'm going to say probably my longest one was maybe 6 or 8 months, but some of my colleagues, they were in for a couple of years. Not that they can't get away and you know, spend time with their families and that type of thing, but some of them can go on for a period of time until you basically got your job done. Sometimes you need to just spend some time and just integrate into the community, which is just hang out, be in the bars, hang out in the streets, talk in the corner, smoke cigarettes, get to know people, start to hang around with some of the locals, that type of thing, and just integrate into their world.
So when you were doing this, the sorts of things you were doing, was there a target in mind, or were these like fishing expeditions? No,
there was always a target in mind. And as I say, most of mine, I always said that I never seemed to get the flashy ones with the fancy sports cars and the big condos and getting to wear nice clothes. I was usually in some smaller town, but they had, you know, there's with what accompanies drugs, there's a lot of other crime. Oftentimes in the smaller communities, petty crimes, break and enters, thefts. That type of thing, and so that was kind of the lifestyle that I would usually kind of work my way in through those types of of acquaintances that I would meet on the street and, you know, develop them. And as I say, get to be seen with them more so than anyone else in the community. And they would often vouch for me and say, hey, she's been here for a couple of weeks. She's fine, no problem.
Do you remember the first time you did it?
The first undercover buy?
The very first undercover
No, I don't.
Really?
I don't. But I did hundreds. I mean, I remember other things that I did other than buy drugs. I remember the first time doing other things, such as posing as a prostitute. I remember that like it was yesterday because it was so different from the work that I normally did. But yeah, there was, I can't really, honestly, I can't, and you're the first person to ask that. I can't remember the
Yeah, that's funny because I would have thought that it would be seared into your memory.
Well, you know what, early on, I didn't do a lot of work by myself. I was the first woman in the OPP to be assigned to this full-time, so I'm the first gal in the office. The guys were great, but I spent a lot of time with them, so I was basically their arm piece for the first weeks or months, and they just sort of took me along to, there was no courses or anything like that. You just kind of learn the lifestyle of being on the streets. And as I say, most of mine were that sort of street level lifestyle. And just hung out with them, and I was with them for their early you know, in a project or whatever when they're buying undercover. And I'm sure at one point somebody said, okay, Kate, this one's yours. And I went ahead with it, but I don't remember it.
Were you given, before you did any of this stuff, were you given any kind of briefing or training on how to talk to these people, how to talk like these people, how to behave in that milieu?
No. No.
It just came to you naturally?
No, well, it came with me. It came to me through my brothers, who you know, who helped train me. I mean, and within those first couple of weeks, I was out on the street, and they just said, "Go panhandle for a couple hours. We'll be around. Go panhandle for a couple hours. Talk to people. Try to get them to give you money. That kind of thing. Kind of hone your persuasion skills, if you will." And it was a good test. I always thought that. My big brothers were never too far away in case something would happen. But I remember doing that on the streets of Toronto, and that would be 1981, 1982.
Okay. You did have one experience where somebody recognized you, right? You write about that in the book. Was it a biker or somebody?
That was actually my partner that got recognized at that particular time. I was working undercover. It was a Toronto project with an outlaw motorcycle gang. And the two undercover officers, both from Toronto, they were getting in fairly deep, and they wanted to have a couple other officers along, so myself and another undercover female officer, and that lasted, gosh, that lasted probably 8 or 10 months, and then he got recognized in the bar one night when somebody, a biker bar, who somebody recognized him, and that basically brought an end to the project, but not without a significant number of arrests.
Yeah, that's got to be a scary moment when you suddenly realize that not only is all your work might get flushed down the toilet, but also there could be some serious repercussions for your personal safety, too.
Well, and that often happens as an undercover officer, that it does, I think, to many of us, you know, not in police work, but saying, oh, I know that person. That person really looks familiar. And if that happened in a bar, you think, oh my gosh, did I arrest him? Or is that a neighbor I had 20, you know what I mean? You have that sort of initial kind of anxiety, and then you just kind of go, oh, well, everything seems to be okay. So.
Let's talk about Quantico. Because you got sent down there, you went to that training area just when the whole profiling and behavioral sciences thing was starting up. And there were few women. In fact, were there just 2 of you, or were there more than 2 of you?
Well,
you hung out with a woman from...
Yeah, there was a woman from Australia. There was 7 of us the year that I spent there, or close to a year. Actually, women are fairly well represented in criminal profiling, and even were at that time. There was, I'm going to say, there was probably about 40 of us before the program came to an end, and I think probably 8 or 10 of us were female. But that was at a time, you're right. I mean, that was just a job ad that got posted on the board, and it was to go on this course for 10 months and to learn about something called criminal profiling, which I'd never even heard of before. But again, looked interesting to me. It was kind of consistent with what my education was, and you know, I worked on the street, and I talked to some people. I actually knew an FBI agent at that time, asked him what his thoughts were, and he said, no, go for it. You know, check it out, see what you think. Nothing ventured, nothing gained.
Yeah. And it was pretty cutting edge at the time, right?
It was.
I mean, it was just...
it was. They were
because J. Edgar Hoover, who ran the FBI up until, what, the early 70s, right? He had no truck with any of this kind of nonsense.
No, it wasn't till he passed away that actually the behavioral sciences unit really got rocking and rolling, and plus that's when the women finally started to get hired back. onto the FBI, because under Hoover's administration they were not welcome in the FBI.
What was it like in that unit? What sorts of things were you learning there?
Well, as you mentioned, it was before the sort of the concept of criminal profiling. There was not many people knew about it, but only a few months after I got there, a movie called Silence of the Lambs was released that really was a very Hollywood version, but it had been filmed there, and a lot of the agents, Thomas Harris's book, he had done his research there, and so they ended up filming the movie there, and you know, there was a lot of accuracy, I guess, as far as location goes and what the working environment was like. But certainly having Clarice Starling, the new rookie, not yet graduated, to take on these cases was a little far-fetched. But you know what? In the end, it helped market the FBI's program. And when I came back to Canada, you know, months later, people were, including police officers. You know, police officers go to movies, they see it, and well, I wonder if that's something. And they heard about me. Having been trained, and so it was helpful, quite frankly, to me.
Well, interesting, because you say that when you came back, and this was all starting to become something that was, if not accepted, at least it was becoming part of police procedure in Ontario, at least, that a lot of the detectives would come to you reluctantly. At first, you know, like, oh Christ, we should go and talk to her. I guess maybe she'll, you know. And it was like that at the beginning, wasn't it?
I mean, there were some. I guess the officers that I knew that in the area that I was going into, which was called Criminal Investigations Branch, there was actually a number of people there that I'd worked with earlier in my career, so they kind of took me under their wing. But I did find kind of the older guys kind of like, not getting many calls from them, but eventually they sort of, and I think maybe it's just with anything new in an office, people need some time to sort of warm up to it, but I had some good successes with the help of Ron McKay, who I worked with closely, who was the first FBI-trained Canadian police officer. Ron was with the RCMP in Ottawa, and so Ron and I worked a lot of cases, and Ron was kind of like an old boys kind of guy as well, so he kind of smoothed some of those roads for me as well. But particularly Toronto Police had been using the services of that particular arm of the FBI for a number of years, so I found actually my biggest business came from Toronto Police initially.
Yeah. When you talk about successes, things like what? Can you give me an example of what one of your early successes was using this method?
Well, so, one of the first cases in 1992, I believe it was, is the murders of Ian and Nancy Blackburn here in Toronto. They had been, we anticipated Ian had gone missing here from Toronto. He was a real estate agent in the city, and he'd gone up to their farm in Caledon to by himself to get ready. He and his wife were going to be up there on the weekend, and his wife, we know that Ian left the office, his real estate office, and that's the last we heard of him. And then Nancy, we knew, had been looking for her husband that evening, had made some calls to friends, and then after that, Nancy went missing. So I went up to, like in most investigations, you know, if you've got a good suspect within 24 hours, that's a good thing. You're probably going to hone in. It's going to be a quick case. But they'd been in for a couple of weeks, and nobody was rising to the top as a potential suspect. So I got involved in that case, profiled it with Ron McKay, and when the case was solved, I think we had only 2 wrong of 30-some characteristics we thought the offender responsible for their crime.
So when you talk about, so let's talk about this in some detail then. When you talk about developing the characteristics, profiling the potential perpetrator of these things. So what you're looking at, what exactly to build that profile? You're
looking at, as I say, traditionally, we're interested in traditional forensics. So that is, what's the cause of death? What's, you know, the victimology? Who is this person? Who is this individual? If it's, you know, in the city of Toronto, why is it this house somebody dies rather than the house on this side or the house on the other side? Sometimes you can get those indications from behavior that occurs within the crime scene. Does it look like someone was invited into the home? Or does it look like there's forced entry into the home? Does it look like there's a friendly altercation, a drink poured, but then all of a sudden furniture is knocked over? Is there some kind of potentially a relationship there, that 2 people got angry with one another, or that one person got angry with the other person? So you're looking for all of those behavioral clues. But in the Ian and Nancy Blackburn case, what was significant for me is the lack of clues. So that is, 2 people go missing basically off the face of the earth. And all we know is that both of them probably, because of some phone calls that were made, were last alive in Caledon, but that's all that we knew. But the scene where they were probably abducted from was very pristine. Nothing was out of order. It was just like somebody would have walked into that house, having a cleaning lady just left it. So those, sometimes it's not just what you're seeing, but what you're not seeing.
Right.
And of course your whole experiences in life and your gender and your background and that kind of thing, all those things can kind of sort of, you bring those personal life experiences. How would you react if something happened? And you bring all of that into that analysis process.
Now in a case like that, where you don't have any suspects, right?
Yes.
There were no suspects.
No.
So you're building basically a profile of some unknown person.
Yes.
But you haven't got anybody to actually compare it to because there aren't any suspects. And in that case, you caught a break because information was released publicly, right?
Yes.
Now, I want to ask you about that aspect of all of this stuff because I know that there's always been some controversy about how much of a police investigation should be let out there and not. In this case, it paid off, didn't it?
Yes, it did. And see, that case, we knew that it was really, we needed to go and release, and this was investigators. I was just at a table around with a number of other investigators, but I think back on the impact I might have had on that conversation is my training in Quantico. Nancy Blackburn's injuries were far different than her husband's injuries.
Yeah. We should say that they were found.
Yes, their bodies were discovered in Toronto, in Toronto, at the residence in Toronto, in a trunk of a car.
Yeah.
And Nancy was treated very differently than her husband was. She was not dressed. She'd had some fairly horrific injuries that occurred to her. And just as I say, the interaction between whatever offender was responsible for her death appeared to be more sexually motivated rather than her husband didn't have any for his cause of death, nothing that seemed sexually motivated at all.
Yeah.
So we knew that Nancy was probably the primary victim here. So again, you're just drawing on what do we know about them, what are their lifestyles, and there was really nothing. I mean, these were just everybody's neighbor in the city of Toronto, good people. So why is it that they're targeted? So having seen the residents, it seemed to us that they were probably, if someone came there, they were probably invited in. There doesn't seem to be this altercation, but something happens at some point. And then we go back to, and again, this is Ron McKay and I and other homicide investigators sitting around a table brainstorming and saying, what's the chances? Maybe it's somebody they know, maybe they don't know him well. It seems like he had Nancy brought up to perhaps the farmhouse, so have her leave the city and come up. So again, this is starting to think, okay, he's interested in having her there at that scene. But also we go back to our training at Quantico, all of the research that's been done on sex offenders, and in this particular case, a sexual sadist, somebody who derives pleasure, sexual pleasure from the injuries and the responses of victims. So, and then, when we jump forward several months and we realize that in actual fact the person is caught in British Columbia, they've left there and committing very similar crimes, victims that were injured in a very similar way. So it made it connect the dots, and we realized, yeah, okay, like we were pretty close on that one. And as when you go back to me just first starting out, that was a great case to have officers be talking about, because better for me not to be flying my flag, let somebody else do it. And so as I say, that was a good one out of the gate case for me to have.
I want to ask you about, you write in the book, and this is interesting, because one of the things that I thought was about doing this job, is the effect that it has to have on you personally. Because, I mean, you talk about being in Quantico, and not only were you being taught things, but there were officers bringing actual cases in that you would get to look at.
Yes.
And then you go out and you start practicing this stuff, and you're seeing cases like the Blackburns and other horrific things. And that has to have some kind of impact on your own psyche. And in the book you talk about trying to maintain that distance. And one of the things that you began to do was to always refer to the good guys, i.e. the victims, and by their first names, and the bad guys, the perpetrators,
just
by
a little
their
salty,
last.
just something really very subtle like that. I don't know why, but it just helped me separate them.
Yeah.
But I also had a job to do. So other police officers, and even today in cases, I mean, somebody's signed to deal with the families, and others are dealing, with the forensics and that kind of thing. So your jobs are very compartmentalized. But any time where I thought that just the whole nature of the violence, of the extreme violence, that there was a couple of occasions in my career, and it was back in an era, and I was the same as everybody else. I didn't say anything. I just thought, oh, I need to take a break. And I did that without telling anybody, even my own husband at the time. Yeah. I just want to take a break away from that. And I did that on a couple of occasions, and then just kind of came back into it again. I was lucky enough in an organization as large as the OPP, there are other jobs that you can do and that kind of thing. And but as I say, in that era, it's very different than today, which I'm so glad that you know, people talk about it and that you can get, you know, assistance and you're not ostracized, or certainly shouldn't be because of it. Is
it that open these days now? I mean, that's recognized, that kind of effect?
Absolutely it is, and certainly a whole lot more programs for police officers to get help confidentially, to speak to that. They don't have to incur the expenses themselves, that organizations will pay for them to have that counseling or whatever it you know, they need at the time. But back in that era, as I say, it was a bit taboo, quite frankly, thought to be seen as a sign of weakness.
A weakness,
Which is why it was very refreshing for me to go to the FBI and have them spend time, even before we got into all these horrific cases, just about how you're going to deal with it, what you're going to do, you know, your personal health, your family life balance, work-life balance. They were ahead of their time on those things.
You talk. I thought this was kind of interesting because, in a way, I think I saw in reading your book, you using that same technique when you make oblique references to your personal life in the book. Your marriage didn't last. Yes. You talk about other members of your family, but it's always in a way, the way you write about it, in a way that is very dispassionate.
Yes.
And I thought, well, is she using the same technique here that she used when she was dealing with these cases? That's one way of keeping it.
No, you know, I'll be honest with you, that's because I know that a lot of the people that I'm writing about are in jail. And I've always been very protective of my personal life and my loved ones. So really, I stay very sort of obtuse about all of that because I don't want people to know who they are.
Absolutely. I can understand that. I wanted to talk to you, you don't spend much of time in your book talking about this, but I wanted to bring it up, the case of Guy Paul Morin. Mm-hmm. He was ultimately released and sued. Mm-hmm. And the people of Canada ended up paying $1.25 million in a settlement for what he went through. Mm-hmm. You talk about the profile that was done in that case. The Christine Jessup was the little girl who was murdered. That's never been solved, that case.
Right.
But the profile that was put together, he seemed to fit it perfectly. Mm-hmm. And yet he wasn't the guy.
Right.
Old friend of mine, Kirk Macon, basically wrote the definitive book on that, Red Rum, back in the early 90s, and took it apart. And that seemed to me, and I want to get you to sort of talk about this a little bit, that in that case, it seemed to be a failure of a number of different police services not sharing information with each other.
Yeah, you're right, and that public inquiry, as there was after the murders of, you know, Kristen, French, Leslie Mahaffy, mm-hmm. Tama Homoka, and other inquiries, there's always things to be learned. And in that particular case, and I mean, how I came to really know as much as I did about the case is because one of my instructors in Quantico was John Douglas. So when I first met him and he found out that I was from Toronto, he was interested in talking to me a bit more. But I mean, I wasn't really familiar with the case, but that sort of a profile being done, and I mean, certainly a profile would never put someone in jail. I mean, that's no forensic evidence there or anything. Right. Something else puts the person in jail. But I mean, when I spoke to John Douglas, it was like, but he never said it was that particular individual. He had the profile done before the information about that particular suspect, I guess at the time, came forward. But that happens a lot in profiling, and more than one occasion, I end a consultation saying, you know, you do it. There's often a suspect, so you don't want to know anything about suspects when you're profiling because you don't want to be tainted. You don't want anything tainted. But then after you've got the profile done, sometimes the part B of many consultations is, can you take a look at this guy and see what you think? And oftentimes you're saying, well, yeah, I think he's a reasonable suspect, but if it's not him, if you think this matches, if it's not him, then it's probably somebody like him that has those same characteristics. But never, as much as police would have wanted you to or enjoyed being told name, date of birth, and where they live. Yes. That's not the world of profiling. It's about just generally what the characteristics of the person.
You mentioned the Bernardo Homolka case, and I wanted to use that as just in our last few minutes to talk a little bit about the involvement that you came into in dealing with the families of victims. And in that case, the families, the Kristen French's family, and you began to realize at some point that not enough attention was really being paid to victims' families and the impact of these crimes.
That's why I wanted to write a book.
Yeah, well, tell me about that, though. What at the time, was that a revelation to you to realize that, hey, we're not, as a police organization, we're not really paying attention to those people who are just as much victims?
I guess it's not so much even the police, because when I was still in charge of behavioral sciences, I started having people like the Frenches come in, and it was very impactful to police because, as I said before, a lot of times police officers never even meet the family. That's not their role in the investigation. But I thought we always had to be cognizant that there are human beings. It was time for you to show the emotional side, and sometimes not all of the people that would come to talk about what it's like to be a victim or a surviving victim's family member were doing well. I mean, the Frenches were a close-knit couple. They had, a strong faith base as well, but you have people like Sheldon Kennedy. When I asked Sheldon to come for the first time, Sheldon was not in a good place, and that's why I asked him to come, because he was the reality of the other extreme of let's not lose sight of the fact that some of these victims don't do so well. And I mean, if you look at Sheldon today, and I just saw him recently as a couple of weeks ago, and he's really, he still has his struggles. He acknowledges his struggles, and even when I was writing the book and I talk about Sheldon, and I called him, I said, Sheldon, I'm going to talk about what it was like when I first met you. Is that okay? And he said, absolutely, that's okay.
He was a real mess, wasn't he?
He was a mess. He was a mess, and he was just barely surviving. He was involved in crime and drugs, and he wasn't in a good place, but I thought that's important for people to see too, but to also be able to say, and as Sheldon says that I quote him in the book, is like he's in a very different place now.
Yeah. When you finally packed it in, did you do it with a certain tinge of regret?
No regrets. No regrets. I think I was just waiting, and I think especially homicide officers, I mean, that wasn't my specialty, but I think a lot of police officers, you wait for that one big case to be solved that you worked on forever, and then you can go. Like, you want to go out on a high note, but I can't remember who it was. Somebody once told me that you're probably just dipping down a little bit when you retire, so don't expect all the fireworks and everything. That, you know what, be content that you're on a nice downhill coast and you're very happy with the peak that you had. And that's really at the time that I retired. I had a cousin who I'd never met, and he came to see me in my office. I was beyond my retirement. I mean, I could have been retired for 3 years, but he just came through the door and he said, would you give me my badge at my graduation? I thought, that'd make a hell of a last day on the job, and that's what I did.
Yeah, and that was a nice kind of bracket at the end, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was.
Well, this has been great. Thanks very much. I really appreciate talking to you.
Thank you. Great. Appreciate it.
Okay.